Check to make sure that we're live. We are live. Here. Are we live on YouTube? We are. Hello, and we're back. Welcome to some Derps Talk About Games. I'm your co-host, Mango.
And I am your co-host, Buddy. Oh my god, has it been almost a month? I thought to myself, I was like, wow, we skipped the podcast for a week. No, we skipped it for multiple weeks.
Yeah, so
life comes at you fast, I guess.
yeah, so for context, I went on vacation and we were gonna do an episode right before I left, and it was like, oh, let's not force it. We couldn't think of anything to talk about. And then I got sick on the way back from my vacation, so we had to miss another week. So today we're going to talk a little bit about power creep or power escalation, since apparently creep hits the Twitch filters.
The Twitch filter was real mad about the word creep, which I find absolutely hilarious.
Yeah. Yeah, this is Buddy's topic idea. So I'll hand it off to you.
Okay, I will. Let me set the stage. There's a couple of pieces that I want to establish first before we really get into this. A couple of months ago, we did a series. This was 3 different podcasts, right? That defined 3 terms that I think of as forces that are acting upon games, the art form, and the industry, right? So these are indification, which I sort of defined as a flattening of sort of, maybe I would call this like tool overhead. Basically, it is easier now to make a game than it ever has been ever before, right? If you or I or Johnny off the street wanted to make a game, it is much easier for them in order to do so and put up that game and make money on it than really ever before. So much so that my career is sort of based on doing this thing, right? And so much so that it's pretty common that the market is being disrupted from the bottom up, right? Which is a pretty unique thing that is happening in games, but isn't necessarily happening in other sorts of places, right? It's not as though indie filmmaking, for instance, is completely taking over and dominating like the box office. The box office is still dominated by stuff like,
James
whatever.
Gunn Superman.
Yeah, exactly.
K-pop
James
Dragon
Gunn
Hunters.
Superman, which I am sure, K-pop Dragon Hunters is also a good one, which I am sure we will do a podcast on very soon because it's the first movie that I want to watch in maybe like the last year. It's like the first movie I've wanted to watch. That's indification, right? It's easier than ever to make a game, and it's easier than ever to make a game, put it on the market, and make real money on it, right? Number 2, roguelitification. Roguelitification describes, in my mind, a widening of players' abilities to understand like the systems and the game spaces. Players are no longer looking for a linear, very sort of curated experience, which was what we would kind of describe as the foundational set of games that were probably dominant all the way up through maybe like the mid 2010s, I would probably say, right? Like these are primarily sort of single player experiences where players are being kind of brought from plot point to plot point, from scene to scene, and the gameplay itself was important, but it was very like specific and curated, right? Players are now looking for a wider set of experiences, and they want to run it back. They want to try things multiple times. They want to explore a much larger space of possibilities than they have really ever been able to sort of explore before. That's kind of roguelitification, right?
Yeah.
And then the last,
I would say the only thing I'd quibble with there is like I don't know how much of it is like player driven, how much of it is also dev driven. In that, like there is like you can kind of get instant infinite content if you can nail the roguelite engine. And so I think there's some dev side pressure from that as well. It's not just kind of consumer demand.
Yeah, I absolutely think that that's true. And the third piece of this is what I call Souls-likeification. And the Souls-likeification is, it's sort of, if roguelitification is describing breadth, Souls-likeification is describing depth, right? It is describing the deepest levels of refinement that are possible in a genre that is treating players not as novices who need to begin from zero in order to learn your sort of systems, but as experts who have been doing this, who have been expressing this skill their entire lives and are looking for a deeper and deeper and more meaningful challenge to sort of underwrite that experience, right? So what I think is happening with roguelitification is players are becoming more advanced and they're looking for a breadth of content. They want to explore, like you said, this infinity kind of sort of content. They're taking something linear and making it planar is the way that I think about it. Because instead of taking this one designated path, which we might think of it, good games are like this. Mass Effect 2, my favorite game, is like this, right? You are now taking different paths. You are exploring all these sort of like different choices, and you want the gameplay to be meaningfully, comprehensively different for sort of like doing that thing, right? And then Souls-likeification is this exact same thing happening, but it's happening inside of the genre that is well worn, right? Obviously, with Souls-like, I'm calling out that this is happening with sort of like RPGs, but I think it's happening everywhere, right? So, for instance, I would think of Stellaris as maybe, or maybe CK3 would be a better example of this. CK3 is like the Souls-likeification of grand strategy kind of games. Maybe I would say Stellaris is better. Like Stellaris is the kind of game that when someone grew up playing Civ 3 and is a good 4X player, wants to play something that challenges them, they sit down and they play Stellaris. And Stellaris offers them the much more complex challenge than
Sure.
what Civilization 3 kind of offered. These are the three forces. I just want to set up some sort of definitions because there's another concept in games that has cropped up from a number of different places, which we would call power creep, right? Power creep is typically defined by the ways in which, especially in live service titles, I think it is possible that power creep happens in outside of live service sort of titles, but it really kind of depends on the way that you define live service. So, for instance, I would say that power creep has happened in Total War Warhammer 3, which is a single-player strategy game, which is a little bit different than the kinds of games I'm about to talk about. But in games like Magic the Gathering, Hearthstone, and World of Warcraft, we are sort of on the precipice of some power creep sort of stuff. And people are talking about some of this power creep side of things. And the question that I came to today was like, okay, where does power creep begin? And sort of these like, how does power creep fit into this matrix of roguelitification, indification, Souls-likeification? That's really the question that I
Okay.
kind of want to answer.
Just to be very complete, because I don't think you actually said the power creep is the kind of general idea that as an ongoing game, right? Usually this hits like games as a service or something in that genre, like a TCG, that as time goes on, the new options are more powerful than the old options. Very cynically, you would say this is because that sells more things, right? You buy, it drives you to buy the new thing because it's the better thing, right? This was being talked about back when we were playing League of Legends, that they made the new champions overpowered because then everybody wants to buy the new champion, right? That kind of thing. Maybe less cynically, that's just kind of how things go, right? Like I think with Magic, there's a good card market video that I will link in the description that we both watched. Part of this is also just kind of complexity creep, which is less about raw power and more about kind of like just kind of like system mastery, right? This is like your Soulsification point, right? Like just from my perspective, there was a point maybe a year or two ago, I feel like, where I suddenly, maybe it's a little bit longer than that, where I felt like the expectation of like knowledge of how the rules worked jumped up in Magic on just like kind of like basic cards, right? The idea that like people like cards that say, take another, I forget what there's a card I was reading that had take another, maybe it was upkeep step. It was basically another phase that like when I started playing Magic, I wouldn't have known was a step. It's just kind of one of those things that you go over intuitively, right? Like in that Magic had kind of got codified after like, after people were playing it because there was a bunch of intuition, right? Like kind of like implicitly passing priority was a thing that kind of happened at the kitchen table. And you only really got into the mechanics of how that actually worked once you were at like a higher level of play. That kind of level of play, I think, has kind of become baseline. I think that's part of this. But this is your topic, so I will let you.
No, I think that is 1000% true, and this is like absolutely attacking some of the stuff that I am kind of that I'm going for, and that I'm sort of getting at, because I super believe that is a, you know, I believe it's a thing that's happening, and what I'm interested in is kind of like where I think things are sort of going from here. I think power creep has here's the place I want to start. Power creep has a negative connotation. When I say the words power creep, I think most players think of they think it is bad. Most players would kind of say, "Ugh, I hate power creep. I just like there is." I don't even know how to phrase this. Okay, super simple power creep example that would get brought up all the time. The strictly better example. In Hearthstone, there's a card called Molten Rager, Magma Rager, I think that came
Yeah,
out.
I think we actually
About,
talked about this a couple of years ago on the podcast.
we 1000% have done a podcast on this. Yeah. So Magma Rager is a 5/1 elemental that costs 3 mana. And in one of Hearthstone's first expansions, the Grand Tournament expansion, they released a Rager that they called Ice Rager, which was a 3 mana 5/2 elemental, right? Ice Rager is fundamentally more. It is strictly better, is what we would call it. It is a strictly better card than Magma Rager, and and it very commonly kind of like got brought up as a sort of problem of power creep, and I think players intrinsically understand sort of an unfairness to that, right? Wait, hold on one second. You're telling me that we are making a strictly better version of this card that has already existed, right? Like, that's bad. This is sort of bad for the game, right? This is, I think, the sort of level zero thinking that people apply to sort of power creep. At the time, the game director of Hearthstone, a guy named Ben Brode, right, very well-known game designer, went on to make Marvel Snap, where he currently, I think, still is the game design or the game director for Marvel Snap. Ben Brode made the argument, I think, in a podcast somewhere, where he basically said, no, that sounds like power creep, but it's not. What he described was a curve, you know, this power curve, and the power curve represents what's playable, right? So things that are on the edge of this curve are all of the things that are showing up in like standard constructed decks and the best decks in the game, right? If a card is not showing up on this curve, and you make a strictly better version of it, and it still doesn't show up on the curve, you have not enacted power creep. And he's making kind of an argument out of sort of like consequentialist sort of thinking, where basically he's saying, listen, if no pro is running Magma Rager in their deck, and no pro is running Ice Rager in their deck, then no power creep has occurred because nobody is running this card. It is under this power curve somewhere, you know, and that's okay. You can't power creep stuff that exists underneath that curve because it's not being run in the first place. It doesn't matter. Nobody cares about these cards. They don't even exist. They're not even being played, right? Which I think is moderately convincing, but I want to step there for a second. What do you think about that sort of framework when it comes to? Do you think of power creep as being like as being sort of like this under the curve? How do you think about any of that stuff?
Yeah, so like I think I will agree with you in that it's moderately convincing, right? Like at the point that like I think I forget who talked about this. I want to say Richard Garfield, but it seems not very Garfieldian to me. That like there are some cards that like have to be duds because you need players to be able to express mastery, right? Like you need somebody to be able to look at Magma Rager and be like, "This is a bad card. I don't want to play it," right? And maybe that's
Mark Rosewater who made this point. Yeah,
that makes more sense. Rosewater.
It was. You told me about this. I think it was on some podcast. I think you linked me to the podcast.
Yeah, I listened to Mark Rosewater's podcast for a while, and I have not because I thought it was bad. Just I already spent too much time listening to podcasts, so I cut some of it. But yeah, basically that there needs to be like, in order for players to be able to express mastery over the system, you have to have better and worse choices. And some of that is like filler cards. And maybe that's apologia for like, Magic printing unplayable cards so they can round out the set. But excuse me. But like I said, it is moderately convincing to me. I do think that it still speaks to. I think that's a good answer, but I don't think it's a complete answer.
Yeah,
Maybe
this is exactly how I feel about it as well. 1000%. It is a good answer, but it only kind of tackles half the problem. Because the natural retort, if I was sitting in a room with Ben Brode and he made that argument to me, I would go, okay, but what about something that does break the power? Like what about something that does break the power curve? That takes something that was right here, maybe it was under the power curve, and then it put it up here, and now it's over the power curve and it is getting run index, right? Those are real cards that exist and are sort of I guess I would just kind of say like in a certain sense I think Ben Brode is sidestepping the issue by only talking about like this case of Magma Rager when there are much better cases, for instance the case of Patches. Okay, so just for context on Hearthstone side, Hearthstone had a card called Stone Tusk Boar. So 1/1 with charge. So it is a 1/1 that can come in and attack the enemy player the turn it comes in. Stone Tusk Boar, it's not played at all. Never. Not even, it's some fringe play in like combo-y kind of decks that could power up a Stone Tusk Boar such that it could hit the opponent in the face for a ton of damage. But at the time of Patches, that was not even close to a deck. And especially at the time of Patches, Stone Tusk Boar would have been considered a bad card. Patches is a little bit different than Stone Tusk Boar because it is a legendary card, so you can only have one of them in your deck, which is technically a downside, but I wouldn't say much of one. Patches is a 1/1. For one, he is a pirate who has charge, but he also had a line of rules text that said, when you play a pirate spell, summon Patches from your deck. So you would, on turn 1, play a 1/1 pirate, and then boom, Patches shoots out of a cannon onto your battlefield and can now attack you. Patches is maybe the best Hearthstone card that has ever been printed. It's like one of those things where if people ever talk about like super giga busted cards, frequently Patches will be the top of that list, because what that second line of text essentially says is draw and play a 1/1 with charge, which is an insanely good effect, right?
And it kind of completely
Patches,
negates that legend downside, right? Because
yes,
it is like the commander problem, right? It's like basically always in your hand. In fact, you don't want to draw it because drawing it gives you card disadvantage, right? Like,
yes, to the extent that in modern Hearthstone, when we talk about drawing a card in your opening hand that you do not want to draw in your opening hand, you call that drawing Patches, because the value of a 1/1 with charge in your hand is so low, but having him in your deck with that ability ready to trigger is so insanely high, right? Patches breaks the power curve, right? Patches takes a card that is down here below the power curve and shifts it up here, right? They eventually nerfed Patches. The nerfing was sort of the answer to this problem. Patches right now does not work that way, right? Patches now, I think he summons himself out of your deck. He doesn't have charge, a couple of other sort of things. Um, uh, if you could ask Ben Brode about Patches, I wonder what would be the answer, because his answer does not sort of satisfy kind of like that condition. Most people, I think their answer would be, that's bad, nerf it, right? Keep the power curve where it is. You want the power curve to be sort of set at this line. You determine this line, keep to this line. Bring stuff that is up here kind of down below this sort of line. I think that is sort of it's sort of like level 2 thinking, right? This I also think is wrong, because you need power creep. You need that version of power creep in order to keep things sort of going and moving. Because one of the things, and this is true of Hearthstone, this is true of Magic the Gathering, and this is also true of even titles that are in a completely different space like World of Warcraft, which we'll get to in a minute. You will never have, so first thing, you will never have everything on that power curve, right?
sure.
It would be impossible to print a set in Hearthstone where every single card is what we would call a 5-star card, right? When people are giving ratings in Hearthstone, a lot of them are using, 1, 2, 3, 4, 4, 5 stars, right? And the person who really codified this is the Hearthstone streamer Trump, unrelated to the, current
President.
president of the United States, right? And the way Trump, the Hearthstone streamer, um, described a 5-star card is it is currently it will be run in a tier 1 deck, right? But the number of tier 1 decks in Hearthstone is never going to be enough to have every single card in a 135 card expansion or whatever the number is in Hearthstone. If I go to HS Replay right now, which is like this is the like they are the ad, the aggregate of all this stuff. I go to their meta and I just kind of take a look and I say, okay, the top tier 1 decks there are 3 of them. It's Quest Paladin, Fishing Priest, Hog, Demon Hunter. That's it. You have, between those 3 decks, you probably have close to 90 cards, but I'm sure they may share 1 or 2, right? Kind of just depending on sort of the nature of things. And that is over the course of 5 sets, right? So 5 sets with 135 cards or whatever, maybe 150 at this point because they have two new like classes or whatever. Let's just like round that up. That's, if we do that across 5 sets, it's 750 sort of cards. 90 cards is what's getting done in there. That is a pretty bad rate. That is like a rate that's, I mean, a little bit more than 10%. That's basically sort of like what you're getting. And so there is always going to be stuff that is kind of like, maybe I would call it unplayably, like unplayably sort of like bad, right? But more important than that, you need things to develop and move forward and escalate, because the only other option is stagnation, and that's really bad. I was listening to a podcast about the Hearthstone, the new Hearthstone expansion is the Vicious Syndicate podcast. The host of that podcast is a guy named Zach O. I think he's a very smart guy. He sort of is the person who is really taking a look at, he looks at top 1000 legend. So these are the best players in the game who are competing for ranking, right? They want to end the season in top 10, in top 5, right? They are really kind of like trying hard in order to be the best people sort of at the game. And he made this point that power creep is like inflation, like in an economist sort of terms, right? All of the political sort of like setup inflation to the side, right? He said, every economy wants a little bit of inflation is good and is important because it keeps people buying stuff, right? The way this works in practice is, let's say I have a 2% inflation. This is what an economist would say. This is a good inflation rate. You want 2% inflation, right? I get $100 from my grandma, right? And I go, well, I'm gonna see what I can do with this, and I put it under my pillow, and I put that under my pillow for a year, and I pull that $100 out, and then I then go buy something. After a year, inflation has hit my $100 by 2%, and now it is worth $98-ish. I mean, whatever, who cares?
Yeah,
Right?
it's
Numbers.
not. Yeah.
It's not actually 98%
Yeah.
because technically you would need $102. Anyway, whatever. Let's call it 98 just for
It's close
simplicity's
enough.
sake. Yeah, close enough.
Set the inflation rate such that 98's the right number, right? Like,
Yeah, it now represents $98. So over the course of that year, my $100 bill has lost $2 of its sort of value, and this creates a very simple apparatus for a person, right? Oh, I should spend my money now. I should spend my money now and do stuff with it. I should invest it. I should buy goods and services. I should do whatever, right? The opposite can happen, deflation. Say we have a 2% deflation rate, right? I pull my $100 bill out after a year. Oh my God, my $100 bill is now worth $102. Well, holy shit! I made the person who went and bought something immediately with their grandma's $100 bill, that person is a fucking sucker. They lost $2. I gained $2. So I'm not going to spend money. Okay. I'm going to hold on to things, right? This is what we would say. And I think the same principle applies to power creep, right? Players, and this is where it interacts with sort of like this indification, roguelitification, all this kind of stuff. Players are always looking for more. Players are not looking for stability. They are looking for challenge. They want things that press the limits of their skills and abilities, that push them farther, that ask more of them, right? And those are the forces of really roguelitification, Souls-litification in action, right? Those two forces in my mind are the culmination of 20 years of players who are doing that. Players like you and me who grew up playing video games and are now playing the more complex version of the video games that we were playing 20 years ago, right? Are players who are looking for more, asking for more, want games to give us more because we are smart, capable players who can express mastery over systems trivially, right? From all that time ago. If I played a game of Civilization 3 right now, I'm going to dominate that game completely compared to something that is more powerful, and like up to my sort of like mastery. Maybe we would call this like a mastery curve or something like that, right? um Power creep is the way that you achieve this in a live service game. And this is sort of the third level of thinking that I think is ultimately correct about a conception of power creep. Power creep is a necessary function of games that are typically, like I said, live service, like any game that is updating over time, because you need to create new stuff that your players are interested in, and that new stuff has to be strong enough that it outpaces the old stuff. Because if that doesn't happen, and there's some good examples of this not happening, right? All that all you get is players playing the old stuff and complaining, right? I want to pause there before we can talk about some of the practical examples of this. This is what I would kind of consider the third level of sort of thinking about power creep. What do you? I don't know. What do you
I
think?
think I think there's a lot to dig into here, because I think you're ultimately right. I think there's other ways to deal, like, the classic way to deal with this without introducing power creep technically is to have like a rotating set, right? Like Hearthstone does this, Magic does this. If you chuck stuff out the back, then you don't have to worry as much about increasing the power. But I think this also talks to the complexity creep thing. I think there's also a whole other lot of other things wrapped up in this. Have you ever?
I would maybe say that complexity creep is a part of this power creep, right?
Oh, absolutely, and it's a way to do it without actually doing technically power creep, right? Like, Civ 4 is not more powerful than Civ 3. It is more, or because Crusader Kings is not more powerful. It's not like playing, who am I thinking of? Who's the Carling? Why can I not remember his name? The Charlemagne. It's not like Charlemagne. It's not like playing Charlemagne. It's not like Charlemagne in Crusader Kings is more powerful than Charlemagne in Civilization, right? It's just a more complex game, right? Which is
okay. Yeah, I would maybe agree with this.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, I guess I would.
It's on live service games. I think it absolutely is partially a power thing, right? Like, even in kind of like very weird, like that. I feel like there's a big point about Destiny in here as well. Destiny the game, Destiny 2. But part of the thing that keeps sticking in my mind is, have you heard the phrase "complexity as a subsidy"?
No.
Okay,
that's a great phrase. I think I immediately understand, but walk me through
it. So again, this has origins in political stuff, right? Like, complexity as a subsidy is kind of like, very classically, is the idea that, like, if you have like a government program that gives some sort of benefit, if you are like a stay-at-home mom that can afford to stay at home, you are more better positioned to take advantage of that program because you have the free time to figure out how to actually get the benefit from the program, whereas someone who is working does not maybe have the time or the effort able to be give to take advantage of that program. And so, like, the complexity acts as a subsidy to those who have the ability. I think part of this too is also the information age, which is kind of part of this complexity as a subsidy kind of thing, which is that, like, say fighting games, right? Frame data was not a thing. Frame data describes how characters move, right? Like, when you punch, how many frames does it take to start up? How many frames is it active? How many frames does it take to recover from? That used to be a thing that you had to like derive yourself, and like maybe you could find it on like a board somewhere, and you couldn't be sure it was true because like it was somebody trying to count it like manually. And fighting games took a little bit longer to get with the program of the modern age, but basically every fighting game now will just give you this information, right? We'll tell you exactly what it is. But as a result, kind of like the baseline expectations for playing the game is higher because that information is available to you, and even if it wasn't, you'd be able to go look it up online, right? This is like kind of like the net decking problem. This is like the commander like brackets problem almost, right?
Yeah.
Like, you know, if the internet didn't exist, the commander bracket problem would be a lot less hard because you and me would like, well, one, we wouldn't have as easy access to individual cards. We wouldn't have access to proxying services. We wouldn't have access to like lists of cards. Like who knows if I would have known that like Ian Malcolm was a card, right? Like, that kind of thing, right? Like this is all I think is.
Or this makes perfect sense to me. It's the kind of thing where you look at a card like Ian Malcolm and you go, "Oh my God, this is amazing!" And you have a dozen tools at your fingertips that lets you go, "What are some of the coolest ways that I can bring a deck like this to life for my friend group?" And as you look, you can see other lists that people have built all over all over the world. People have built a bunch of Ian Malcolm decks, and you can write down all of the cards that they have included that you go, "Oh, I would never have thought of Possibility Storm,"
Right.
because you're not going to look through every single card that has ever existed, right? And figure out the interactions of Ian Malcolm and Possibility and like all of the rest of that. That makes perfect sense to me.
Yeah, I mean, and this happens like in the real world too. Like this is like people talk about no longer being able to get like cheap flights or like cheap concert tickets. It's because you don't have to stand in line at the record store anymore, right? Like you don't have to know that it's you can like click on Ticketmaster and like they average. It's the same kind of thing. And I think it's a little bit broader than you're casting it, but I think it's all part of unless you're a greater part of this phenomenon that you're talking
No,
about.
I think complexity as a subsidy is such a great term. I immediately understood. I wasn't obviously thinking about a stay-at-home mod, but I definitely was thinking about, I weirdly, because, we're thinking about buying a house. I thought of it as buying a house. I was like, oh my God. Actually, I wasn't even buying a house. It was, so my computer broke, this computer right here that you're looking at. It just wasn't starting. It was Thursday or something like that. And I thought to myself, um, I can solve this issue. I know how computers work. Rachel absolutely can solve this issue. Rachel built this whole computer for me, essentially, right? If we sat down, I'm sure we could go through, we could test each individual component, we could find the part that wasn't sort of like working or whatever. But like, we have jobs. I had to go to work. So I Googled, I looked for a PC repair place, and I went through a set of pretty unhinged interactions. If I explain this on the podcast, you'd be like, buddy, no. Where I brought this computer to this guy's house. You know what? I will explain because it is funny. So I was trying to look for like a good service. I found this guy called like Apple. It was like Apple iPhone Repair New Hampshire or something like that, which was like pretty prominent on Google. He had like 50 good reviews or something like that. But I was like, I bet people can pay for reviews. I feel like if I was running this service, I would pay for reviews. I called the number. It's clearly this guy's cell phone. I go, hey, my PC has a problem. I have a meeting in 45 minutes. I need to drop it off somewhere where somebody can take care of it. Is that something you could do? He said, yes, bring it to the thing. My son is working the desk. That's what he told me. My son is working the desk. And I did that. I unplugged everything as fast as I could. I threw it all into my car. I drove to the location in Google Maps. It's just his house. It is this guy's house, but it has a sign out front. Okay, pretty respectable. I walk in. There is in fact a desk that is sort of in his like foyer, and his clearly teenage son, like maybe a 15-year-old kid who is bewildered. Clearly the dad hasn't said anything. And I said, hey, I called about dropping my PC off. He was like, okay, put it on that couch. And I put it on the couch. And I said, what do I do? Should I like put a phone number or something on this? And he said, yeah, I think that's a good idea. So he found a scrap piece of paper and I wrote my phone number, put it on top of the tower, and I just left. And I got in my car and I drove away. Now, later that night, I thought to myself, wait, I didn't get a receipt. I never saw this guy face to face. I never even really talked. Like, I talked to him, but he was sort of like gone. There's like a non-zero chance that I could have been scanned for my like $5,000 computer or whatever. Probably worth less than that now. Obviously, it's been however many years. But I went back. I hooked up my laptop. I got to work. Rachel obviously like worked. We kind of like moved on. Theoretically, we could have solved this problem, but we just didn't have sort of the time. We had other stuff that we kind of had to, we sort of had to do, and I ended up paying for it, right? Quite literally, I had to pay someone to solve a problem that I could have solved myself, but I didn't. I had money and I did not have time, right? And I think of that as that's like a pretty good expression of sort of this complexity,
Yeah.
complexity as a sort of substitute.
Yeah, no, I mean that's
Oh.
also kind of classical. Oh, what is it? It's like division of labor, right? Like like labor specialization, right? Like even if you could have done a better job yourself, it is better to pay someone to do it for you because you could be using your time in a in a more economical way, essentially.
Yeah.
In a better way. But yeah, but to kind of roll it all back to power creep, I do think that like all of that is kind of wrapped up in this, and this is part of why it's happening, right? Like,
Yeah.
you know, in the yeah, did you know that Metroid's a girl, right? Like that kind of thing, right? Like, the idea that like Samus Aran, you beat the game, takes her helmet off, and you discover that she's been a woman this entire time. That's like a thing that you can't do now, right? Like, where it's harder to do now, right? Like, you have to kind of like, basically, it only works if you like buy into and enforce spoiler culture, right? Which is part of probably why that's so much of a thing, right? Like, it's like, um, I think that's all part of the of this space. I kind of got off track there, but did that successfully
Yeah,
respond to you?
I definitely agree. I think part of this honestly comes down to like my, the reason that I find this so attractive is I think it actually just speaks to my personal like foundational philosophy, right? I think of humans as progress machines. We are as a race of beings, right? We are constantly getting better and improving upon ourselves and standing on shoulders of progressively taller and taller giants in order to learn and grow and do things better than sort of before. And I think this is just kind of like a representation of sort of some of that kind of stuff. But to focus a little bit on kind of this core example, right? A little bit of power creep is good. I definitely think that that's the case, but that's not to say that power creep creeps forever, right? With something like inflation, there is not a good mechanism to do what I'm about to describe, but we don't live in a world of economy. That's just an analogy. It is, there is a way that we can tackle power creep, and there's a couple of different interesting ways that we can do them, right? And three of them have been displayed for us right, kind of right on top of each other as I would sort of say. To start with Hearthstone. The new Hearthstone just came out. It's called The Lost City of Ungoro. Ungoro, it is a sequel to a previous Hearthstone expansion, a much beloved Hearthstone expansion called Journey to Ungoro, which is actually, I would probably say, many people, like if you were to pull all of Hearthstone, I think quite a lot of people would say this was peak, the golden era of Hearthstone. This was really the first two expansions. Here just had a ton of flavor. This was also the Lich King expansion that would later come out. I think it's like Rise of March Lich King, something like that. Um, and our Knights of the Lich King is actually what it is, because it's an alternate universe where all of the Hearthstone heroes have been turned into Death Knights, kind of thing, right? Debuted hero cards for the first time. All of this stuff is sort of like wrapped up in sort of history, but when the expansion came out, when the Hearthstone expansion came out, um, it had terrible win rates for the newest decks. So, as I was talking a little bit about, the top decks in the Hearthstone meta, Quest Paladin, Fishing Priest, Hog Hunter, right? There is one of those decks that is a new deck. That is Quest Paladin. Quests are a big feature in Journey to Ungoro. They came back in the Lost City to Ungoro. Quest Paladin has a 64% win rate at kind of bronze to gold tiers, right? Kind of the bottom end of the ladder. So it is farming it is just farming this level of things. As I scroll down, I'm seeing quite a lot of decks that I would consider to be, sort of these old decks, these stagnant decks, right? Fishing Priest, Hog Demon Hunter, those are old decks. We have Menagerie, Death Knight, Protoss Priest, and Pew Paladin. These are also old decks. And Pew Paladin was the old sort of meta sort of tyrant. Space Death Knight, which is maybe the best deck in the game, is in here. Taunt Warrior, Protoss Mage, there's a bunch. And as I'm looking through, I'm not seeing all that many quest decks. Where are all the quest decks? Okay, we get our first one after Quest Paladin. We have Quest Druid, which is a tier 3 deck with a 45% win rate. So you are losing more often than you are, but respectively, it is the second highest quest deck with that 45% win. As we go down, we get to Quest Warrior. Okay, 42% win rate. All right, that's our number 3. Quest Death Knight at 41%, Quest Mage at a clean 40, right? But then I get to the bottom of the list, and it is literally Quest Shaman, 34%, Quest Warlock, 33%. All the way to the bottom, Quest Rogue with 22% win rate, okay? For every game that you win of Quest Rogue, you have to lose 3, which is that's just a brutal sort of state of affairs for a new expansion, right? And what this has led to is a player base in revolt, a player base who basically goes, what the fuck? I wanted to have fun. I ripped open all these cool new cards. I want to play with my cool new cards because they are cool and new and fun, but all I am doing is getting farmed by old decks that I have been playing against for the 4 months, right? Now, to a certain extent, you don't want a ton of power creep. You don't want to you don't want to release quests and have every quest deck be at the top of the meta. This would be, a pretty nightmare scenario, where now what you're doing is you're saying, oh, well, there's no reason the only stuff that's worth buying is the most recent stuff because everything else is worthless, right? You want actually to have a space for people to play cards from previous expansions. Space Death Knight, which is a fun deck. I played a lot of Space Death Knight. The core cards that came from that came out in an expansion 2 expansions ago. You could be playing Space Death Knight for the last 8 months and been having a good time. And if that's your favorite deck ever, you should just sit and queue. You should be able to sit and queue Space Death Knight and have a pretty good time, right? The problem is when everything that you have just released is underperforming, you're kind of baiting your audience. You're sort of saying, hey, I know that you wanted to do something new. I know that the meta has crystallized into sort of a position that is fun and, whatever, interesting. But we want to try something new. I'm going to give you a bunch of new stuff or a bunch of new toys to play around with, right? And you're being punished for playing with those toys. Is really what it feels like. This is sort of like the worst case scenario. This is sort of the deflation version. When you undershoot on power creep, all you do is entrench the power of the already powerful stuff, but you convince a large portion of your audience to try out bad things that will then get farmed by the good things, which sucks. That is a unfun, sort of thing to kind of walk. Hearthstone solves this problem with buffs and nerfs, right? But it also solves this problem, like you said, with rotation. Rotation is a really powerful force in Hearthstone. It is the idea that every year we're just going to drop a bunch of stuff off the back of the wagon and we will reset. We will kind of bring power back down. We used to have 6 sets that would all define our sort of power. We're going to go back down. We're going to bring it all the way back down to 4. And in that process, we are going to get rid of some of the most powerful cards, the older cards that have just done some kind of terrible, unfun stuff. And we are going to really emphasize sort of the new, interesting, whatever else stuff that is sort of out there. So I do think that Hearthstone does manage its power creep that way. But if it is not kind of hitting this 2% inflation sort of number, what you end up with is situations like now where people are posting to the top of the Hearthstone subreddit that this is a terrible follow-up to a beloved expansion because everything is so underpowered and it's so unfun to play right now because you just get farmed by, these old decks.
Yeah, no, that makes total sense. And something that I meant to bring up that I kind of didn't. It's like this is also like, you know, beyond the kind of like the more interesting thing. It's also an entry point for new players, right? Otherwise, you have this problem where people who have been playing for forever are just forever beyond any new player's ability to catch up. And so if you whiff on that reset point, then like, you know, like if I decided to get back into Hearthstone, right? Like if I didn't know any better and I jumped in and I bought a bunch of these new cards, I would have a bad time. It sounds like, and you know, I'd probably bounce off the game, right? Like so.
Yep.
That is part of the problem with this as well. Like that's not necessarily a point for inflation, although it does help to kind of be like, oh, you're new, you get like a little bit of beginner's luck essentially. But like that's at least an argument for at least keeping it power at like at levels so that, you know, a new player can come in and compete.
Yeah. I also think there's kind of like a, I don't know, maybe I would call it sort of like a piece of this, which is sort of defined by your ability to sort of like tinker in, you know, like kind of tinker in post. This is kind of how Hearthstone expansions work. Obviously, I think that there are like bad versions of things that exist and that kind of like come out or whatever. This can be a bad expansion. But the other piece of it that typically happens, generally speaking, is they are going to buff and nerf a number of different things. And the ability for Hearthstone to nerf cards that are overperforming, to buff cards that are underperforming, and I think it's really that second one that's going to matter most, is one of the key ways that with they can really interact with power creep, right? If things are outside of this power curve in general right now, they've released a lot of new cards that are not up to snuff on the power curve. The answer is to just bring it up, bring them up, buff them, make them more powerful, make them more you know, stronger, better to build around, more fun to build around, more fun to interact with, right? And there are a number of good options that I'm sure, you know, any individual designer on the Hearthstone team would be capable of sort of naming out in order to solve this, and we'll get a balance patch in the not too distant. But you know, at a certain point, this buffing and nerfing is kind of the way they handle sort of things. Magic the Gathering doesn't have that option. Outside of errata, which is the kind of buffing and nerfing that you can do for a paper kind of card game. Errata is, you know, every card has a certain sort of set of rules text on it. That rules text can change, but it's complicated, and when they do change it, you know, it kind of get future printed. So the best version of this is Lightning Bolt used to say, deal 3 damage to target creature or player. Now it says deal 3 damage, and that's just because they have introduced a new card type. That card type is Planeswalker. Lightning Bolt can hit a Planeswalker, but if I were to cast the Lightning Bolt from Alpha, it does not say the word Planeswalker because Planeswalkers didn't exist. This is very, like, the simplest version.
Yeah, and the function of errata isn't typically to actually like do a balance change. it's to kind of like adjust the text on the card to be in line with like the rules in theory, I guess is the best way to put it.
There is one iteration, I think, ever in all of Magic where they used errata to change the function of technically 10 cards in order to address this, and this is the companion mechanic.
Oh, yeah.
Companion was commander in, you know, standard, but you had to sort of build a deck with a certain deck building restriction, and then you got this companion. They eventually errated companion because it was such a bad mechanic and so hated. They errated companion to say you have to pay 3 to pull your companion out of the command, essentially. So that was a meaningful errata. It places a 3-mana tax
Sure.
on all of these kind of companions, right? Which essentially killed them as an archetype in the format, as far as my understanding goes. But it's the only time I think they've ever used errata to buff or nerf basically anything. The other thing that Magic the Gathering has done for the purpose of addressing power creep, though, is banning cards. And in standard right now, they have announced a set of bans that is the most sweeping bans literally in 20 years. When I was playing standard in 2003, I want to say, I was playing Onslaught Mirrodin standard. And I was going up against a deck called Affinity, which was quite good, but it was not very well refined at the time. A set came out called the Darksteel, and Darksteel took Affinity and shot it through the roof to make probably the most broken Magic deck of all time, which would be the kind of old Affinity package that used to exist. To address this, they banned 7 cards. Disciple of the Vault, they banned Arcbound Ravager, and they banned a cycle of 5 artifact lands. So each of those is effectively the same card, but just for a different color. But it gets you to 5. That gets you to 7. That is not the case of the current standard ban. The current standard bans, they banned 7 cards, and they are key cards in a number of different decks. One of them is called Monstrous Rage. It is basically +3/+1 and trample onto a target who is making a red deck's win, a red aggro deck. Incredibly, just incredibly powerful, right? But they ended up nerfing a bunch of other kind of cards along. Some of these, they basically took the key cards in a number of different standard decks, and they said all of these decks are overperforming. The most recent set that set is Final Fantasy. Final Fantasy basically added a handful of cards to the best decks in the format, which were Is It Prowess and Mono Red, sort of like aggro. And otherwise, they were unchanged. And the standard environment was people just jamming these old decks over and over again. And basically, Wizard said, I don't want you playing old decks anymore. Please play with my new Final Fantasy, make new archetypes with Final Fantasy cards. We are banning the key cards in a number of different decks. One of them is called Omniscience, which basically had you discard the card Omniscience, the most powerful. It's a 10 mana card that says you can cast spells and you can cast spells without paying their mana cost. Omniscience says basically it was a reanimator deck. Put it into the graveyard and then reanimate. So you would discard your Omniscience, reanimate it with Abuelo's Awakening, and then flood the board with a bunch of stuff that you don't have to pay for, right? There was a deck called Pixie that was all about it was using bounce triggers. So basically, you would get a bunch of stuff that has really good enter the battlefield effects. So it would be like a 1 mana black card that enters the battlefield. You to just and you would bounce it back to your hand and replay it over. Right. They got rid of a couple of cards out of that deck, and they got rid of a couple of cards out of called Golgari Roots or something like that. Just getting rid of a couple of green cards that were being used in these sorts of things. And so the Magic the Gathering, the way that Magic the Gathering decided to address power creep was by pulling down taking the most powerful cards that were in the individual decks in the meta at the time and just getting rid of them, just sweeping, poof, get out of here. We don't want to see you. We don't want to play Monstrous Rage or this town ain't big enough. And they basically kind of completely got rid of those from sort of the meta. I don't play standard. I don't really care about standard, but in my mind, I thought of kind of 2 interesting examples that are 2 sides of the same coin. Both of them are about releasing expansion that is underpowered and watching players play the stagnating, old format decks, and then kind of making real changes to try and address this. We don't know what Hearthstone is going to do. My bet is Hearthstone is going to end up buffing quests, or maybe nerfing individual cards. Magic obviously has chosen to just straight up ban cards because it's the best way that they have to affect things. And that kind of, I don't know, that kind of is what it is.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. And then, again, very cynical, but the Magic also has the kind of what's the word, the incentive to kind of sell a bunch of their very popular crossover crossover property, and you want the hardcores to buy a bunch of those cards too because you need them to move product essentially, right? But but that'll
Yeah,
makes
I
sense.
do think that is sort of the cynical answer, but I think it's a fair, I don't know. I think it's a fair answer. Is I guess
Sure.
what I would say.
Yeah.
Okay. The last piece of this that I wanted to talk about is maybe the one that's a little bit of the odd duck out, but that is World of Warcraft. So we are walking up to the new patch 11.2 releases in 3 weeks. Wow, fucking Jesus Christ. It releases in 3 fucking weeks? Jesus. Uh every patch represents sort of a reset where the item levels kind of like go up and sort of the rest of it. And World of Warcraft has done a thing with power creep that the other, that these other sort of games don't do, which is kind of just embrace it. They just let it happen, right? Outside of a number of times where there have been stat squishes, which we could count on one hand, right? It's not as though stat squishes happen constantly or every time. We get one every other expansion. There was one in Warlords. I actually think I can count them on one hand. One in Warlords, one in Battle for Azeroth, one in Shadowlands. And I don't think we've seen one since Shadowlands. Is that right?
I think that's
Yeah.
right.
Yeah, because Dragonflight didn't have one. Neither did. Yeah. So there have been 3 total sort of addressings of power creep over the course of like World of Warcraft's sort of history. And I think part of what WoW has really done is obfuscate sort of quantitative power creep with maybe what I would call qualitative power creep. So, for instance, quantitative power creep is the process of number getting bigger. The numbers that I am hitting right now, I'm critting for 2.5 million or something. If I crit with Bloodthirst, like the basic Fury Warrior ability, I do 2.5 million damage, right? The quantitative power creep of that doesn't really matter because of the nature of how things have scaled up right alongside me. So, for instance, quantitative power creep in Hearthstone matters because my hero still has 30 health, right? I still have 10 mana crystals. So when Ice Rager, my hero power still hits for 1. When Ice Rager creeps up from from Magma Rager, a 5/1 becomes 5/2. Well, now it takes 2 hero powers. It takes 4 mana invested in my hero power to kill the same sort of like creature, right? What WoW has sort of done is just scale up all numbers together, right? My Bloodthirst hits for 2.5 million, right? But the enemies have 387 million health. And they just keep getting more health. They're going to give that stuff sort of like more health. So in a what I would call sort of relative sense, I actually don't think there's been very much at all in World of Warcraft. There's a couple of edge cases which we can maybe sort of like talk about. But because WoW sort of brings up all tides together, in a certain sense, it feels like there's power creep, but there's really not, right? The numbers are all getting bigger, but actually
But all the numbers are getting all the numbers are getting bigger. Yeah.
The amount of damage I am doing relative to boss health really is saying the same, right? Which I think is represented well in damage. Damage meters will say at the end of a kill, how much of the boss's health did you do? And pretty commonly, I'm sure if I logged on right now and I checked our we did Galliwix kill. I guess you were sick. We did a Galliwix kill on last Tuesday's raid. I was probably 10% of that damage. That. And I bet if you were to go back in time, you would see that my damage amounts to about 10% with this raid size and all this other kind of stuff. Because at the end of the day, I'm about as solid a player, and balance is about kind of like, sort of what it is. And so from that perspective, I haven't power crept at all, right? The other side of this, though, is that power creep is definitely happening in World of Warcraft. And it's happening in what I would call kind of qualitative ways. So this is the power creep of like more complicated. This would be the complexity side, right? I was thinking about it in the version of tier sets. How when Dragonflight launched, the tier sets were very basic, which they said was on purpose, right? They wanted people to get an understanding of sort of the new talent builds and all the rest of that. So the tier sets are very straightforward, right? But by the end of the expansion, those tier sets were pretty complicated. They were doing really complicated sort of things, right? I think the same thing happened in the War Within. Our first tier set my first tier set was super basic. It was extra 5% buff on. It was a 5% crit rate on this one ability, and then it was when you crit with this ability, this thing happens, right? Now my tier set is you will proc a thing that makes your crit rate go up to 75%, and then for the duration of that thing, every time you crit, you lower one of your cooldowns by 12 seconds, right? Which creates this whole mini game tracking of, I've activated the buff. Let me jam this button as often as possible in order to take as much advantage of this cooldown reduction. That's a much more complex sort of kind of understanding of things. And now in the newest or I'm sorry, the newest patch, the tier sets are all going to be based not on my class and spec, which is what they're currently based on. They're going to be based on my hero talent, which is even one level sort of like lower. Now, I am not only playing my spec, I am also playing the hero talents from that spec, and my hero talents are going to be changed by this extra sort of thing, which is a whole other kind of like level of sort of complexity. And so what I think happens with World of Warcraft, the kind of power creep that we see in World of Warcraft, is really happening on this complexity creep sort of level. And what happens is we then come into sort of pruning phases where we bring all of that stuff back. The best way that we, sort of talked about this is with stuff like artifacts and covenants and this borrowed power sort of problem that we have done about 100,000 podcasts for. This is, who would have guessed it, a power creep problem.
Yeah, no, that makes perfect sense, right? Um, I do think.
There is one extra piece. I mean, I don't know. What do you want to say?
Oh, I just want to say that, like, this kind of complexity creep is part and parcel of kind of like um, player mastery, right? Like you have to give players more opportunity to do the rotation right in order to kind of like make this expressive. Like, kind of famously, I think we talked about this when they did WoW Classic. The raids were actually really easy to beat because they weren't actually that complex. It was always just kind of like the wrangling 40 cats problem, especially in an age where like it wasn't as much adults playing, and it was kids who had to like do their homework type of deal. Excuse me. But I think that's all part of it. But you were going to jump into something.
Yeah, I think there's another extra side of things, and this is a side of things that I think of as a little bit of a disagreement, maybe. There's a certain kind of I've laid out this complexity creep for WoW as like they are adding new things for sort of like the classes to do, but I also think going one level deeper than that, it's not actually a real complexity problem because everyone sort of short circuits this by reading guides. You just go, you get new tier set, you get new whatever, you are simming your gear and going and reading a class guide on how this stuff works in the first place. You're not really thinking it isn't really affecting things all that much. Because you're kind of getting rid of some of that sort of decision making by going through these sort of rituals. But at the same time, I think that there's a temptation to say that this kind of thing is bad. Typically, typically we would think of removing that level of decision bad thing. I think if I were on this was the part when we were talking in the pre-show. I said I feel like we would end up picking a fight with the Distraction Makers, which is another podcast we've referenced times. Distraction Makers has sort of talked about how decision making is core to games, right? A game is good when it is asking you to make decisions, and it's bad when it's not. And I understand what they're going for, and that's typically very true. But I actually think there's quite a lot of value to ritual in games. I think the ritual of putting a sim through, like putting my gear through sims, there's no decision there, but it's fun and I like doing it. You know what I mean? It is cool to put something through sims and know that I have a powerful item and that this powerful item is gonna remain on my character. Best item that I could possibly get. Another version of this is working towards a best in slot list. I'm not actually making the decision. I'm not making any decisions there. There's no decision of what trinket am I running. I'm literally getting rid of the decision by looking up a list that can get rid of it for me, but it's still really satisfying to get that trinket and wear it and use it to its kind of like maximum effectiveness. And I would call this sort of the satisfaction of ritual. And I think that that's a perfectly sort of like valid piece of that's kind of like a perfectly valid piece of sort of gaming. And I would think of it as kind of the way in which WoW sort of addresses its power creep problem is ritual. It kind of asks you to perform a number of rituals in order to sort of do that thing, and those rituals can be satisfying kind of in
Yeah, I I think I'm with you like I would say like 80 to 90% of the way there, right? Like I buy this ritual thing. Um but I do think that you get into a little bit of complexity as subsidy thing here, right? Cuz like
Hmm.
you have to know to go sim things, right? Like,
Absolutely.
and
Yeah.
you have to go do that, right? Like this is, you know, um, and this is something they've talked about with like pulling back on weak auras, right? Like and
Yeah.
pulling back on the ability to kind of like program out these decisions. Um, is that it is maybe a problem of maybe a different kind that you absolutely have to go outside the game to this third party website and hit this button to try and figure out if if this stat stick is better than this other stat stick. Um, and and it can kind of be, I don't know, maybe it's a problem's maybe the wrong word. um Maybe it's less than optimal. It's like, oh, I would like to use the fun trinket where I launch a car at the enemy and it hits them, right? But no, that sim's worse. Go get the stat stick that like makes your haste 30% more on average every 15 seconds, right? Like um which uh that's, I don't know. I think in an ideal, I don't know, ideal world, maybe in an ideal world you'd be able to kind of like do both with like enough level of fidelity that it wouldn't be too big of a problem. And maybe this is all falling into this trap that we've talked about before, that like you don't actually have to play optimally, right? Like um none of us are playing at the level where it matters all that much how much how much if your sim is 1% better or not. But it is a thing. The alternative, I guess, is kind of like guess, right? Like which is actually kind of like fundamentally worse in a lot of ways, right? Like if I can't, if it is illegible to me as like a normal human to look at a piece of gear and know that it's better, um, then I can't meaningfully make a decision about the piece of gear, and I don't know if I'm actually chasing anything. Um, like again, maybe I could come up with a scenario where like maybe I in the best world every like secondary stat has like um you know a strat associated with it, and they're all roughly on par, right? Like maybe I would like to be a mastery monk, and that's like just as valuable as a haste monk, and those two things like affect my rotation. But that's a level of complexity that I think is like basically impossible to kind of hit in the current way that WoW works. But that's I think that's a different, that's not quite a power creep issue. That's kind of like a game system issue, maybe.
Yeah, I think there's also a piece of this that I would definitely agree with, which is that like the ritual can be satisfying, but it can also be really unsatisfying, right?
Yeah.
And at a certain point, I feel like when I burn myself out on WoW, I'm burning myself out on rituals, where I am doing tons and tons of things, but I am making no active, like actual sort of decisions, kind of alongside those. And when I'm kind of craving that sort of like decision making game that is all about decision making, something like Total War or something like that, right? Like this is a game that is constant decision making, in sort of comparison, because even though, I mean, I guess technically speaking any game can kind of get to this point, but just for me, WoW is a game where I'm not really making all too many sort of, there's different levels of sort of gameplay, right? I'm making quite a lot of second to second decisions, but not a lot of minute to minute decisions, if that makes sense. Where I'm going, what I'm doing, all of that kind of stuff. Those decisions are pretty rote, and I'm almost always kind of like farming out for just doing what's sort of like best, basically. Um,
I,
and
I would say I think you do get some of a reflection of some of this where people are like, Mog is endgame, right? Like transmog
yeah,
is endgame, or like, mount collecting is end. Like, the true endgame is like how you choose to spend your time to um, effectively change the aesthetics of your character, because the power level is kind of set, right? And you're just kind of pushing towards like a known endpoint type of deal. Um, yeah.
yeah. Okay, well, that gets to the, I don't know, that gets to the end of it. Um, is there more that you wanted to sort of hit on here?
No, I think we can go into our 4 weeks, however long it's been.
Yeah, Jesus Christ. Yeah, tell me about. I mean, what happened? Like, what happened on this cruise?
So the beginning part of the cruise, so I went on a it was like 3 days on land, 7 days at sea to Alaska, something like that. Which was super fun. The land part was to me the highlight. I went to started like didn't really do anything in Anchorage. That was supposed to just kind of like the landing point. We went to it was a Princess cruise. They have a lodge that is like halfway to Denali. They say that like 70% of people don't actually get to see Denali because of the cloud patterns. I am part of that 70%. We saw the base of it at various points, but I did not get an opportunity to see the peak. We then went to Denali National Park. It was all kind of abbreviated just because of the the timelines on things, but it's very beautiful. The mountains are stunning. Alaska is a very interesting place. There was a version of me that considered moving out to Alaska when I was much younger. Just kind of like, kind of like very beginning end of kind of like the remote work thing. It's like, I could do Alaska, right? It's an interesting place. Sun was out until 11:30 at night because it was like that time of year. But like, at least when I imagined, I was like, imagine kind of like, high noon all day. Where Alaska is latitude wise, it's kind of like kind of like low early evening sun all day, right? Like it's kind of like it feels like right now where we are in New Hampshire, when it gets to like 6:37, it felt like that all the way until like 11:30 p.m. and it started like relatively early. Mr.
Okay.
Collins is here. He says hi.
Hi. Oh my God, little boy.
Um,
He's finally regrown his hair. Okay.
yeah. You could maybe if you stared at him a little bit, you could tell. Oh, now he's gone. But what else? Saw a bunch of wildlife. I thought it was an incredibly cool experience. The cruise part of it was a bit worse. There were some fun parts, like we went to what was the name of it? Skagway is the name of the town. So you end up learning a bunch of stuff about Alaska on these things, right? But basically Southeast Alaska is a bunch of basically disconnected towns that you get to mainly by water. Like Skagway, you drive basically a half hour to get to Canada, and then you drive the other like 30 minutes to get to like the Walmart in Yukon, Canada. And that's kind of like how it kind of works out there. But the towns are all like super touristy, right? Like they all have like a bunch of like gold rush history that you can go into, but now it's all kind of like, basically places that try and sell stuff to tourists and people on these cruises. And so it's mixed. I posted this to one of our shared chats, but in Ketchikan, which is the closest thing to like a real town, there was like a local game store that I popped into and asked if they had any Final Fantasy Commander decks because I figured, if anywhere, Alaska might have some. They did not. The nature is incredibly beautiful. There is something cool about seeing things in person you just kind of don't get through a screen, right? Like the glaciers are very cool. Like, just kind of like how blue the ice is. I forget what the scientific kind of thing is about it. But also just kind of like how things all work, right? Like such like a neutral, like, because there's so little sun, like kind of like the energy density basically of the entire area is a little bit off. Not off, just like less. And so it's like, there are, did you get dogwood trees down in California? I think they said they were down in California.
Good question. Dogwood trees. I definitely know dogwood trees, but I don't know if they are in California or not.
Yeah. Anyway, in the lower 48, as they would say, they grow to trees. In Alaska, they're just ground cover. They don't get enough energy to grow into trees. It's kind of like
Oh, interesting.
There's this thing called fireweed, which is like after, occasionally there are fires, and this is mostly a natural process. And then when it burns stuff away, excuse me, this fireweed is these flowers that grow back like immediately after the fire. They're like the first things to grow back, and then there's a whole ecosystem there that you end up hearing about a half dozen times about how it all works. There's this plant called cow parsnip, which if you get it on your skin and then you like UV light hits it, you will get second degree burns. And they talk about this all the time. It's like, oh, okay, got to be careful about that. And I'm looking at it. It grows all throughout the United States. It just doesn't have enough of a competitive edge to really be a danger, say where we are, right? But it like has like a niche up in Alaska where like there's just like not enough.
So what you're saying is the lower 48s have power crept, I'm
Yeah,
sorry, cow weed?
cow parsnip, yeah.
Cow parsnip into submission, okay.
Yeah. Basically that kind of stuff. And obviously there's a lot of like, it was funny to me because it's like there's like there's moose, there's what else did I swans, there's all sorts of interesting wildlife. We saw some caribou, but it's like a lot of it reminded me of like here, but with like bigger mountains, like much more impressive mountains, right? The mountains, like Mount Denali is I believe the largest mountain in North America. Or I guess it's Mount McKinley now. But it was interesting, like hearing. So it was originally Mount McKinley, and then got Barack Obama, I believe, changed it to Denali, and then President Trump has changed it back to McKinley. It was interesting because like a couple of tour guides were like, "Look, we have always called it Denali, even when it was like basically Ohio was like, don't change it from McKinley because we love because McKinley I believe was from Ohio, and but basically we always called it Denali. It doesn't matter that it's McKinley again because we're just going to keep calling it Denali because we always called it Denali, right? Like and it wasn't like a political thing. It was just kind of like, well, that's what we call it, right? Which was a little bit interesting, I guess. But everybody talks about how like in the winter months you either leave or you go insane because it's like 2 hours of daylight, right? Like which is
Wow.
Yeah.
People leave. I did not realize that. I've always thought to myself that Alaska would be sweet. I feel like I would have a good time going to Alaska. But part of that is like I think of myself as like a homebody who really enjoys sitting at a computer for a gazillion hours a day.
Yeah, no, that was my thought too. Is like I bet you gamers could make this work, right? Like who blot out the sun on their own anyway. But apparently it's got like the worst alcoholism problem of any of the states, which is kind of like you're in the dark for like 6 months of the year, right? Like and it gets worse as you go further north, obviously. It's also just kind of enormous, right? Like there's a lot there. But yeah, that's a lot of like not a lot else to get into from that angle. The cruise part was like I went on a cruise. I feel like the last time we did was like when I was a kid, and this felt like a significantly worse experience as kind of like a mass market cruise, just because lots of one, I think part of it is it was an older ship, also just kind of like it's very commercialized, and it kind of like had this. I remember when I was a kid, it was kind of like this floating hedonism barge that was just kind of like interesting from that perspective. I think part of it too is the weather, right? Like the weather in Alaska isn't very warm, and so like on the sea days, it's like literally all you have to do is like eat food, right? Like there's no like hang out at the pool. I guess you could in the misty rain and like 60-degree weather, but that's not exactly a fun thing to do. And everything's overpriced, and much like how we complain about in video games about like DLC, right? Like everything gets nickeled and dimed, right? Like I
feel like I could see a version of a cruise be a lot of fun as sort of like a floating hotel where like imagine like a big group of us like who got together for your bachelor party. We all did that, but we took a cruise instead.
Yeah,
I bet that would have been a great, right? Just because it's a good simple place to get a ton of like fun people together to go do play Commander and D&D and Super Smash Brothers or like whatever else. But I feel like I would probably go a little bit crazy if like my stimulation was coming from, I guess it sounds like kind of docents at a museum level. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like,
except the museum actually has like stuff to do, right? Like whereas like here I like maybe could have like I could have gone to maybe the fitness room a little bit more often, but it just kind of wasn't like it didn't feel super engaging, and and I don't know. It was.
But also, what are you gonna do? Sit in your hotel, or not your hotel? Sit in your cabin and play a I don't know, whatever, fucking Expedition 33 or something like that. I guess you beat Expedition 33.
Yeah. No, I a lot of what I did was sit in my room and like do a little bit of side work on Future Vibe Check, honestly, right? Like just because I had a good enough internet connection to make that work. And like part of it is like I'm engaged. Um, another part of this too is that my fiance could not get the time off to join us, so it was just me and my parents. And I love my parents dearly. I don't think they watch this podcast. There's only so much of them I can take in like a concentrated burst before
Yeah, I totally understand that. I mean, listen, I would have Rachel. Rachel's mother lives in this lake. My mother-in-law lives in this lake complex. It's not really a complex. It's not like there's like walls or anything like that. Basically, there was in 1922, there was this group of Lutheran pastors who bought this land and dammed a river to make a lake, and they basically kind of made it like a resort town for themselves, right? So, if you were a Lutheran pastor who was, ministering to the dominantly German communities in northeast Pennsylvania, Poconos, right? You would spend a week, you would go up to your cabin on the lake, right? That was built by Rachel's great grandfather. And you would just kind of like hang out and sort of that kind of thing. We are now 100 years from that position, right? In 2025, 103 years founding of this kind of thing. The lake is still private and the land is still owned by the association, but the association now is sort of no longer Lutheran, sort of the children of these like Lutheran pastors and stuff like that, right? Rachel is not the great grandchild of pastor. She is weirdly sort of inherited in because of the place that her great grandfather had as the person building the cabins that the ministers were ministering from. But generally speaking, it seems as though it is just the place where a bunch of people have a cool sort of like lake house and they all pay into the association to kind of keep the land private and all. And I became quite an outdoorsman, which was definitely. But we were having this thing where Rachel was like, I built this werewolf deck for Rachel. Her character in World of Warcraft is a worgen. Obviously, Fenia is a worgen. So I made a deck, and she was like, I want to play my werewolf deck. We spent the whole drive down, 5.5 hours from 8 p.m. to 2 in the morning or whatever it was. Just talking about Magic, where I was talking about the lore, I was talking about, player archetypes, I was talking certain concepts. She was like, I want you to, I was like, I think you should pick one of my decks and learn to play it alongside this like werewolf deck kind of thing. And she was like, okay, well, can you tell me about my decks? I was gladly spent an hour and a half the intricacies of Commander deck that I have in sort of like that box. We were really interested and excited to sort of play Commander, but her mom sort of had this itinerary of stuff to do, and I was a little like, man, we just wanted to go to the tea room, play Commander. Is that allowed? And the answer is sort of no. But that lake house is cool as fuck, and I want to bring all of our friends. Is the moral of the story is I just want to be like, let's all drive to the Poconos and go to this cool ass chill fucking lake and hang out for a weekend kind of thing. I did play an insane amount of I probably played more Magic the Gathering in the last 3 weeks than maybe the last like 3 months combined, it feels like. We got together a number of different times. Literally on Friday night I went to Ryan's house, we played, and Josh couldn't make it, and we were like, well, Tracy's working tomorrow morning. What if we played in the morning? And we had matinee at my house where everybody came over on Saturday morning, and then we played. And then Spell Table that evening, which is the first time I've ever used. Have you ever played Spell Table?
No.
It sucks. I don't love it, but it sucks in the sense of it's worse than real sort of like Magic. It's kind of got like roll 20. Yeah, it's kind of got like this roll 20 problem, but it's still a fun time. It wasn't the worst thing in the world. It was reasonably fun. I executed a kind of 2-card combo. I guess this would be a good question. In the Commander brackets, a bracket 3 deck has few tutors and doesn't have any 2-card combos. Okay. In my Stella Lee deck, I have a combo. Stella basically says, tap copy target instant or sorcery spell. You choose new targets for the copy. And if you ever target Stella with a card, in this case, this card is Cerulean Wisp, is 1 blue mana. It says untap target creature. You can execute that game action infinite time. The reason it matters for Cerulean Wisps is it's a cantrip. It says untap target creature, draw a card. So I can hit Stella Lee with it and then draw my whole deck if I want, right? I used this in conjunction with a level 3 wizard class, which is a Baldur's Gate spell, and it says the level 3 version says whenever you draw a card, put a +1/+1 counter on target creature. This is how Stella wins games. You turn drawing cards into a win condition, essentially. I drew like 25 cards. I put 25 +1/+1 counters on Stella, and then I swung at somebody who had no blockers for 25 damage to kill them. And they said that was a 2-card combo. And I said, it absolutely was not, because I needed the wizard class to put the +1/+1 counters, right? What do you think? Yes or no?
So what are the parts? It's Stella, the cantrip, and the wizard class.
Yeah, Stella, the cantrip, and the wizard class. I would think of this as a very bad combo, right? If I was playing the good version of this, I would have a Thassa's Oracle, which would still be a 3-card combo, but it would auto-win the game, right? I would draw my whole deck, play Thassa's Oracle at 0 cards, win the game on Thassa's Oracle.
Yeah,
or you could do Lab Maniac or Jace Wielder of Mysteries.
I would maybe maybe I'll split the baby and I'll call it a 2.5 card combo, because that third card can be one of many things, right? Like,
Yeah.
and maybe that's where I would say, like, it is easy enough to find a thing to kind of layer on top of it, which is more complex than a 2-card combo, but it's not like it's a super hard thing to do. So yeah, I would call it 2.5 card combo, right? Like Bruvac has a 2-card combo, right? Which I didn't even realize
that you used.
Yeah.
In fact, I would say that's a 2-card combo.
Oh, it absolutely is. I put my Bruvac deck into Archidect, and it's like, this is a bracket 4 deck. I'm like, oh, I didn't realize that.
Yeah, I'm surprised you have that combo in the Bruvac deck. I feel like if I were expecting, like, if I were going to, guess what the deck list was, I wouldn't have put whatever it is. It's like Jace's Erasure or something like that.
It's got some other name, but it's basically a thing that makes you discard half your deck and then discard.
Yeah, and then Bruvac doubles it to get the other half. Yeah.
Yeah. Which is not a thing I was thinking. It was basically like, I wanted most to do like persistent petitioners, but I want like a couple little juice cards in there to kind of like make it not just play the same card 60 times, right? And so like that is like this definition of kind of like, look up all the mill cards and pick some, right? Like or like look up Bruvac and see what other cards they play with them, right? That kind of thing, right? Like
yeah, it's funny because I played the Stella deck a number of times and I've won with it a number of times. But I said at the table, I said, I don't think I've ever attacked with Stella ever before. It just so happened that I drew this wizard class in my hand and I didn't have good play, so I leveled it up to 3. And to be fair, I do think of it as a win condition, in the sense of Stella wins the game by drawing cards. It is just sometimes drawn cards you win by slinging a ton of spells with a Gutter Snipe, which is normally how Stella wins. Sometimes it's Niv Mizzet. I think this is how I've won with like a game that you and I played. I just Niv Mizzet and then I like Windfalled and I copied the Windfall 2 times, and then Niv Mizzet just pings everybody, right? This is another one of those win conditions. It just turns drawing cards into +1/+1 counters. But it just so happened that the only creature I had in play that could attack was Stella, and so I was hitting people for commander damage, which I thought of as a pretty fun thing. The thing that was great about that game, and I will say, I scammed a win off this deck. The reason I really won that game is Josh kind of threw. Josh was playing like behind me in the turn order. He went before I went, basically. I killed Alex. The next player, May, mustered a pretty reasonable sort of defense, but didn't remove Stella with these +1/+1 counters. Josh probably could have killed me, but I sort of laid, I like Machiavellian. I was like, he had a card in play called Elish, like Norn's Annex. It's an artifact that says creatures can't attack you unless their controller plays 2 life for the attack. And I was at 7 HP. And so Josh was like, I was like, that Norn's Annex makes it very hard to attack you because my life total is so low. And he was like, oh. And so he set me to 2 life and was like, now you have to attack May. You can't attack me, and then you'll attack May, and then come around sort of like the circle or whatever. And I was like, yeah, I don't know, you got me. Whatever. And then he passed turn, and I Vandal blasted the Norn's Annex and attacked because I just drawn 25 cards. Of course, I had artifact from movement. Which was, that's Commander at its best, I guess I would say. But yeah, we played a bunch of different, which I'm pretty jazzed about. And I don't know, there's a new Magic set on the horizon. I've been thinking about doing a pre-release for one. I have not done a pre-release, so the idea of going back and doing a pre-release, doing one, pretty interesting. Even though I don't super care about Edge of Eternities, it looks actually quite fun. I do think I like Edge of, just based on what I'm seeing. But yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. What was I gonna say? Yeah. No. I mean, I have been kind of out of it. Basically, what happened with me is when I got, well, first of all, on the plane, I watched Ratatouille, which is the first time I'd seen it. Which kind of, I think that movie single-handedly explains millennial foodie culture. Like, I think that's like the genesis of millennial foodie. I didn't like realize it, but I think.
Oh my god, is that the genesis of millennial foodie culture?
I think it might be.
You've never seen Ratatouille?
No,
Have you and I ever talked about Ratatouille? It's my favorite Pixar film. I had this whole thing at PAX, which I know, which you were not there for because of Monic's wedding. I had this whole thing at PAX where we were at dinner, and we were talking about Pixar, and Xavier said that his favorite Pixar movie is Finding Nemo, and I call that a basic bitch opinion. Because it's such a norm. Everybody says Finding Nemo, and then he was like, "What's your one?" And I said Ratatouille, and he was like, "I think that's the basic bitch opinion." And I said, "You know what? Ratatouille does the complicated nature of a father-son relationship better than Finding Nemo does, even though Finding Nemo is nominally about a father-son relationship." But anyway, yeah. So you think it's the genesis of food culture?
Yeah. I mean, it is kind of like really like lovingly goes into like a lot of cooking stuff, and then like there's a scene where like Remy talking to his brother is trying to explain like how to like understand flavors and flavor combinations, and I'm like, oh, I bet this got in a lot of people's heads, and like really kind of like pushed kind of like not only fine dining but kind of like millennial desire to kind of like do their own cooking, right? Like this is the thing that I do, but I pin that more to kind of like my Italian American cultural roots than I do to like any particular movie. And not that I think that it doesn't exist outside of that culture, but I do think that something like Ratatouille is part of the driving force there, because I know it was like widely loved, and like that was still like in the monoculture days where like everybody kind of like consumed the same media, and so I my guess is it's part of it. That's just
my god, I was thinking about the monoculture recently. I feel like we should do a podcast on culture, or sort of the death on the monoculture. I think it's super interesting.
I
I'm
agree.
thinking about it a lot because of Superman. I think of as a little bit of a return. I think the sort of highlight of the monoculture is this is, I guess, a preview of this podcast we'll end up doing. The highlight of the monoculture, or it's sort of the, they would call it like the canary in the coal mine a little bit. It was the Marvel Cinematic Universe, right? As the monoculture died, so did we get to kind of this point with the Marvel Cinematic Universe. But Superman, it's kind of, I mean, I don't know. I guess Superman, it's a huge comic book movie from a beloved property, whatever. And mostly it is that James Gunn is like I would think probably one of the most respected directors in blockbuster filmmaking, maybe ever, but absolutely in the current. But everybody's talking about Superman. I really want to go see Superman. I've had that to like go see something and be a part of the monoculture again, which I have just not in the longest time.
I mean, I think there was some of it around like Barbenheimer, right? Like that was.
Oh, that's a good point.
I think there are events that still like pierce into the monoculture, but I think it's kind of like, mostly dead. But we can talk about that in a later episode. I also watched Beetlejuice and Beetlejuice, which was.
Did you like the original?
I did. I liked the original quite a bit. The sequel was fine, but kind of forgettable. And like, it's not bad, but it's not gonna stick with me. It kind of like hits this kind of like, it's not quite as bad as like Remember Beetlejuice, but it kind of like teases on that kind of thing. It's like you kind of got to do the original movie, but without kind of like the piece of it that like Beetlejuice doesn't even show up in the original movie until like the 45-minute mark of a 1.5 hour long movie. Like show up significantly. He kind of like shows up in like a kind of like past, but he doesn't like become a character in the narrative until like 45 minutes in.
It is funny to me because I loved Beetlejuice as a kid. I remember watching the movie and thinking it was awesome as a kid, and I rewatched it as an adult, and there are a handful of times where I feel like I could really pinpoint this, but Beetlejuice, the first one, would be a good example to me of like, I think if I were a kid today, I would not care about Beetlejuice the movie. I think Beetlejuice is kind of maybe something like a not quite a lowest common denominator in a way, but in a way, I sort of think it was like the way I was interacting with it was bad. Like as a kid, all I cared about was like spooky, weird, kooky, morbid sort of stuff. And also, it came out in '89, I guess I would say. So I first saw it, I first saw it in the '90s somewhere. I was maybe like 6 or 7, and like it was maybe the first time where like death was kind of real. I almost want to say is like, I don't know, almost as like a real kind of like plot point. Um, and so there was something about watching Beetlejuice as a kid that I can feel abstractly. I feel like I could sit down and I could describe it, but I couldn't access that at all in the modern era because I just think that I don't know, it is supplanted by modern stuff.
I think you can buy that. Like it definitely was kind of like interesting for it. I think the original does have a lot of charm that kind of like you don't get the sequel, not because the sequel isn't trying, but just because like it's just trying to be Beetlejuice. And this is the problem with like Ant-Man 2, right? Ant-Man and the Wasp, I guess. It was like I really like the original Ant-Man, and Ant-Man 2 was trying to recreate Ant-Man, and it just didn't feel organic. And I feel like you get the same thing with Beetlejuice.
Yeah. You know what's funny? This happened to me not in a real sense, but over the last couple of weeks. While we were with Rachel's mom, we referenced my love of the movie Titanic, which is actually a medium interesting example of this because Titanic is a movie that I loved as a kid for a completely different reason than I loved as an adult, right? As a kid, I loved it as the shipwreck disaster movie, right? And that part is great, and I still do love kind of the tragedy of it. But now I think of it entirely sort of as like the melodramatic like romance, right? But Rachel's mom was like, "Oh, they're making a Titanic too." I was like, "What on earth? They're making a Titanic? What does that even look like?" And she was like, "Yeah, Rose goes on another ship and to get over her fear of whatever, and there's a man who looks like Jack, and maybe he survived, and maybe he, or whatever." And I was like, I have to understand this. And you know what it was a fan cut trailer that was like using a bunch of different, like there's that iconic Caprio's Gatsby in The Great Gatsby. He turns around, he's wearing and when I saw that, I was like, oh, I understand. You saw this on like Facebook or something and thought it was real, but it is just like some college student riffing on the fact that Kate Winslet and Leonardo DiCaprio. But I like freaked out for a second when I thought that we were gonna get Titanic 2, right? Like.
Yeah, no, Great Gatsby was on the film list actually, and I was like, oh, maybe I should watch this. And then I looked it up, it's like, it's got bad ratings. Like, I'm gonna watch something. Ended up watching Late Night with the Devil as my third selection, which was super fun. I would recommend it. David Dastmalchian, smaller kind of thing. I thought it was good. Fun fact about Beetlejuice. I'm basically the couple, which was like a young Alec Baldwin, which was interesting. They don't reprise roles, but basically everybody else does. The character for the dad dies off screen, and they do like an animated segment. The dad of what's the actor? Winona Ryder's dad.
Yeah.
They do like an animated segment to show how he dies, and then when he shows up in the movie, he gets eaten by a shark. So like his afterlife body is just like the bottom half of his body. It's like, huh. I wonder what happened. Did the actor die? I go, father in Beetlejuice, Jeffrey Jones. Huh, still alive. Why wasn't he in the sequel? arrested
'cause
on
he's like a
charges.
sex offender.
Yeah, arrested on charges of child pornography.
Oh, I actually know who this is. I think of him as the Ferris Bueller guy.
He's the Ferris Bueller
but-
principal. Yeah, that's his
Yeah,
other
he's the Ferris Bueller principal. It's the same guy. Yeah.
Yeah.
Wow. You know what? Good dodge there.
Yeah.
Okay. It's funny to me how much Tim Burton defined so much. I loved all those Tim Burton movies.
Yeah.
And I still actually do. I there are a lot of Tim Burton haters, I think, in the modern era, right? If I were to talk to any like film nerd, if you had like your brother on the podcast or something like that, I'm sure he would maybe. This is me being a little bit mean to your brother. I'm sorry. Your brother is smarter than this, and not sort of like a Kino bro is maybe who I'm sort of like parodying. I feel like the Kino bro opinion of quite down, that he was never really good in the first place and mostly is just kind of a stylist, and the stylism doesn't hold up, which I think that's a real thing that happens to directors. J.J. Abrams would be the best example of this, but I don't think that's true of Tim Burton. I think Tim Burton's golden era is golden, right? But his modern era, I hate like all of everything after like Corpse Bride, including Corpse Bride. I would probably think it's like the downhill trend of Tim Burton. He had that weird Alice in Wonderland movie. I fucking hated that.
Yeah.
I hated so many of his like stuff, but I don't know. Big Fish, that movie rocks, is super good. Same thing with, I don't know, a bunch of stuff from that early era, including his Batman movie.
Yeah, and like Nightmare Before Christmas, right? Like,
Yeah.
Define millennial goth culture. Speaking of like, culture defining movies.
Listen, as a deep lover of millennial goth culture, who knows every word to every song in Nightmare Before Christmas, okay, and whose very first girlfriend was in fact the most millennial goth I think I could ever in my life describe to you. Yeah, it was pretty fucking important. I would probably say. That also felt like a fucked up movie to watch as a kid. There's a lot of, I don't know, there's this thing of like childhood. Do you know who Edward Gorey is? Have you ever heard this name before?
No.
Edward Gorey is an artist who I actually weirdly think is from New Hampshire. Edward Gorey is an artist who made children's book, very macabre children's book. The one that I think of most is called the Ghastly Crumb Tinies, which is an ABC book, like A is for blank, B is for whatever, right? But it is, A is for Anna, who fell down the stairs. B is for Basil, devoured by bears, right? And it is an ABC book of all of these children, and they are dying. And there's like there's storybook illustrations where you see Anna looking down a huge staircase, right? And reaching up for the railing, but not quite able to sort of like get it, and it's like teetering, and you're like, oh fuck, they're about to die. And then Basil is in he's like, it's like a zoo enclosure where he's leaning over, seeing the bears, but you just see leaning over. This kid is gonna let him die. You could probably go find, I'm sure, typed in Ghastly Crumb Tinies, super famous. But there's like that sort of like childhood macabre shit is great, and I do deeply love it.
Yeah, I think I might have not been permitted to watch Nightmare Before Christmas when I was a kid because my parents were afraid I was going to get scared or something.
There were very few things. I mean, obviously, I was talking about watching Titan 7, which had tits in it, so there were very few things I was not permitted to watch as a kid.
Yeah, the only other thing I think I've got to talk about here is basically so on Steam sale I picked up Star Wars Galactic Battlefront 2 for $5, and I like derped around in that, and I was like, this is okay. What I really want to do is swing around in a grapple hook, and so I reinstalled Titanfall 2 and played that a bunch. And then just kind of on a whim, I was like, I kind of want to practice my wingman shots. I'm going to install Apex to use the training mode in Apex. And I discovered that Apex now has like a mixtape mode, which is basically like bog standard shooter modes that like on like a rotating, like a time-based rotating list. I was like, I'm just going to play this for a while. Because like I could go into a whole thing about how like I like Titanfall 2, but like the curve of a match eventually I think it's too saturated by Titans. I think there's a whole thing here that we could talk about is like Titanfall 2 as like the midpoint between hero shooters and like classic kind of like, like Call of Duty's a step on this, RPG elements list. Titanfall 2 is, I think, another step where like Titans effectively act as ultimates, but they're all overtuned, but you can fight them against each other, so it kind of works. But I think that they dominate too much of like the late stages of a match in that game. All the way to kind of like a Overwatch 2 style hero shooter. But I was kind of like, I just kind of want to like play the pilot combat, which there's a mode for, but like there's not enough players to kind of really support it. But I basically am getting that in Apex Legends. I just kind of like, play Pathfinder and zip around in my grappling hook and like shoot poorly. Part of this too is like I ended up downloading like an aim trainer because I want to like get better at like tracking people. So I'm doing that, but that's been basically my gaming stuff. Since I did beat Expedition 33, fantastic game. Go play it. If you speak any French, play it with the French dub. I think there's this is a very, very mild spoiler. There are 2 endings, and I went and I watched the one I didn't do on YouTube, but the YouTube clips are all in English. I was like, these voices are all wrong. It should be in French with English subtitles, which I think is the correct way to enjoy the game. But it's
I had intended to play Expedition 33, but I just it was like impossible to find the time, to be honest.
Yeah, hey,
it just feels like
I put like 30 or 40 hours into it, I think. Actually, let's look how much I put into it. Anyway, I think the next thing I'm going to play is I'm going to go back and finish Death Stranding 1. Because Death Stranding 2 came out, and I'm going to wait for that to come on PC probably. Player Obscure. Time played 2.9 days. So that's 2.9 days.
Wow, that's actually pretty respectable.
Yeah.
In terms of playtime, I would say.
And I did everything but the super secret optional boss, which I might eventually go back and do. But that's like the boss for sickos, because essentially if you play once you hit the end of Act 2, the end of Act 3 is kind of just there, and you go and like finish a bunch of stuff. But if you go do that, you basically overpower yourself. Like if you go and play this, I would say if you want detailed instructions, I will tell you. But for anybody out there, when you are done with Act 3, essentially there's a mechanic that you unlock at the end of Act 2 that like turns off a damage cap. You want to put that damage cap back on for the final fight, just so you like see all of the dialogue, because otherwise you will just like blow through the final boss in like a single hit. It's kind of nuts. But yeah, it's a great game. Go play the game.
Okay, holy fuck.
I would say if Buddy ends up playing it, we will do a full episode on it. But it is.
Yeah, I do. It is the kind of thing that I do want to play, but it's the kind of thing that you want to play by like lighting a bunch of. Oh, I have a whole night where I have no sort of things, but finding that this is like it's the Goldilocks problem.
Yeah.
I'm just like I never have that. I have 45 minutes before or after D&D, and I just want to chill out, and so I'm going to rip a bunch of Hearthstone matches, right? Which ended up dominating quite a lot of my time, to be honest with you. And also Collector's Bounty and WoW, which is this thing where they increase the drop rate on like mounts and transmog and stuff. And so I've just been going and farming. I've got a bunch of these like super rare mounts that I, talking about power creep. I never would have for the life binders handmaiden or something, except for right now, because they increased the drop chance from 1% to 5% or whatever it is. And it's just like, oh, 1 out of 100, that fucking sucks. I'm never doing that. Oh, 1 out of 20, fuck yeah, let's go. Roll up. Like
Yeah, no, for my end, like, it was funny. The only games I really played on vacation was I was like sitting in at like, 9 p.m. when the sun's still out in Denali. I'm like, oh shit, the month ends in like 2 days, and I need to finish my travel log. And so I like got on and like, derped my way on my shitty laptop. I purposely have a shitty laptop so that I can't play games easily on the road. And it's like, shittily, did like 3 world quests so I could like finish out the traveler's log. But but yeah.
I understand that. Okay, I deeply get that.
Yeah. But yeah. We've been going for a while, probably warranted given that we were gone for a while. But it is late, and we both have work tomorrow. So maybe we should wrap this up here.
Yeah.
All right. Well, if you'd like to tell email us about any of your thoughts on what we talked about in this episode, you can email us at derpsgames.com or podcast at derpsgames.com, or it's derpsgames@gmail.com or podcast at derpsgames.com. You can watch these live at twitch.tv/derpsgames or youtube.com/derpsgames. Rate and review us wherever you find podcasts. All links will be down in the description. Buddy, do you have anything you're looking to promote?
There's nothing I'm looking to promote.
All right. Well, in that case, I'm going to say, until next time, dear listeners.
Until next time, loyal listeners, farewell.